Hello, JBS viewers. I'm David Harris, and this is Defending Israel. A very happy, sweet, and meaningful Pesach, Passover, to all of you celebrating the holiday. Our guest this week is Hillel Neuer, the renowned executive director of United Nations Watch, based in Geneva, and a tenacious defender of human rights and the proper place of Israel in the global community. And in the interest of full disclosure, I should say that many years ago, I succeeded the late Morris Abram, the founder of United Nations Watch, and served for an interim period as the chair of UN Watch, and subsequently as the host at the American Jewish Committee for UN Watch when Hillel Neuer was hired. The UN Watch today is an independent organization, and I'm delighted to have Hillel on the show. Welcome, Hillel.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hillel, just dial back for a moment before we explore the issues today and tell those viewers who are not familiar with UN Watch how and why it was founded in 1993, and briefly what the journey has been until today.
Sure. It was founded by a great American named Morris Abram, whom you mentioned briefly. He was a civil rights leader. He was active in the 1950s, helping Martin Luther King before it was a fashionable cause. He helped get Martin Luther King out of prison, introduced him to the Kennedy family, and eventually Morris Abram was renowned himself for having won the 1963 case of Gray versus Saunders, achieving the recognition by the United States Supreme Court of one man, one vote, at a time when in Georgia, through manipulation of certain county systems, the votes of Black people were not being counted fairly, and Morris Abram defeated that. And he was president of the American Jewish Committee, a leader of the Soviet Jewry movement, and many other important causes, and eventually was named U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in Europe. And when he retired in 1993, he remained in Geneva, and having been ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, as it was then called, he understood many of the serious defects facing the UN. He supported the United Nations, but he knew that it had to be held to account. Americans especially appreciate the concept of checks and balances. Sadly, they don't really exist at the United Nations, and Morris Abrams saw the need for an outside body that would fight on universal issues, holding the UN to account, speaking out for the founding principles of the UN Charter, and also fighting anti-Semitism and the unequal treatment of Israel. And that's how it was established in 1993, initially under the auspices of the World Jewish Congress, then under the umbrella of the American Jewish Committee, now, as you mentioned, for the past decade or so, independent. And today we continue to speak out for the rights of Jewish people not to be discriminated against in so many ways at the UN when Israel is targeted, and various anti-Semitic experts are appointed to the UN, like Francesca Albanese, to name just one.
We're going to get to her in a moment.
Yeah, and we're active for human rights. So in May of this year, on May 15th, UN Watch will host the 16th annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, featuring some of the leading dissidents who've either been in prison or their family members are in prison from China, Cuba, Russia, Venezuela, and other serial human rights abusing countries.
Hillel, as I knew Morris quite well before he passed away, I remember that one of the things that he said was, after spending 4 years in Geneva as the U.S. ambassador, he realized that Geneva was really a dirty, dark little secret, that there were very few journalists based in Geneva. Most of the attention was focused on New York, on First Avenue and 43rd Street, but that a lot was going on in Geneva that most people never saw, but that was really quite pernicious. Can you, first of all, construct for us what goes on in Geneva for those who may only be familiar with the UN in New York, and then what is it that is so pernicious potentially?
Sure. Look, the UN, I would say, has two major campuses. There's more than two, but the major ones, of course, are New York, where the United Nations General Assembly, which is considered the parliament of the UN, all 193 member states have a seat there. The Security Council, of course, the most senior authority at the United Nations, and then the Secretary General and his leading advisors, among other things. Those are some of the leading institutions in New York. And Geneva is host to maybe 20 different specialized agencies. Some of the most famous ones are the World Health Organization, obviously became very well known during COVID, but it's something that is needed throughout the year. The International Labour Organization, one of the oldest international bodies, precedes the UN by many years. The World Trade Organization in Geneva, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, and many other agencies. One of the more notorious ones is what's now known as the Human Rights Council. They meet 3 times a year. They adopt resolutions, create commissions of inquiry. So those are just some of the many agencies. There's others dealing with telecommunications, intellectual property, and so on. Those are the UN. And of course, UN adjacent, you might say, are agencies like the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, which some people, certainly those who care about Israel, will be deeply concerned on how they have failed to step up to the plate in the past 6 months regarding the hostages. Not that they could do everything, but there's clearly more that they could have done. And also, the ICRC has been, when they make pronouncements, singling out Israel. And of course, their new director general, starting on April 1st, they named Pierre Krahenbuhl, who was the former head of UNRWA and someone who had to resign in a very major scandal, mismanagement, abuse of power that he presided over. And despite all that, he was named head of ICRC. So those might be some of the kinds of things, perhaps that Morris Abram sensed, that are going on in Geneva.
So if I remember correctly, it was probably about 2006 that then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan led a process of reviewing and reforming, or so he thought, what was called the UN Human Rights Commission, now the Council. Has it in fact been reformed, or is it as bad as it was then?
Well, they did make some changes, but in terms of the essential defects that they were meant to cure, sadly, they have not done so. And in some ways, it's actually gotten worse. So the main issue that Kofi Annan identified was politicization, selectivity, and the membership. He talked about the fact that members were joining not to defend human rights, but to shield their own abuses and those of their allies. And if we look today at the members of the reformed Human Rights Council, we see members such as China, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Pakistan. Some of the world's worst dictatorships are sitting on the Human Rights Council, or sat for many years, like Russia and Venezuela were on for many years until recently. And actually, if you count the numbers, 60% of the current members failed to meet the minimal standards of a free democracy established by Freedom House. They're either full-on dictatorships or other forms of non-democracies. And of course, if those are the members, what you're going to get is a corresponding result, which is a body. It's not actually defending human rights, but in many cases is subverting human rights.
And just to put a fine point on this, am I correct in remembering that it was 2003 perhaps, that Libya, Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, was elected to chair the UN Human Rights Commission, correct?
That is correct. And just for people to have a bit of context, the founding chair in 1946, when it all began, was none other than Eleanor Roosevelt, the great humanitarian of the age. And so 1946, Eleanor Roosevelt, and indeed, as you said, David, 2003, the regime of brutal dictator Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, 2003.
And while we're speaking about this, Hillel, and I want to really now sort of delve into the current issues and Israel's place in it, but we're talking about the fact that Iran, a subject that you've been advocating very loudly and powerfully about, it sits on both the Women's Commission and on the Disarmament Commission. Is it not the current chair today, as we meet, you and I, the chair of the UN's Disarmament Committee? Or is that just an extended April Fool's joke?
No, sadly, it is true. Iran is not only a member of the UN Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, but it is currently the chair until May. Now, it should be noted that its chairmanship took place as a result of an alphabetic rotation. But having said that, when North Korea took its seat, when Syria took its seat, numerous countries took the floor and said that this was outrageous and that those countries had no credibility to hold the chairmanship. Sadly, when Iran took its seat about a month ago, there was maybe a handful of statements, but nothing notable by our democracies. And that may have sent the wrong signal among other wrong signals that are being sent on Iran. In New York at the Women's Rights Commission, Iran was elected a couple of years ago because of the Women, Life, Freedom movement. There was a reversal, and America, which had been silent when Iran was elected, the Biden administration initially was silent and refused to comment when Iran was elected to the Women's Rights Commission, which is known as the Commission on the Status of Women. But after the Women, Life, Freedom movement broke out with the death in custody of Mahsa Amini, a young woman who was arrested and died in custody after apparently being beaten for having worn an improper hijab. Revolution broke out on the streets of Iran, or an attempt of peaceful demonstrations. And in wake of that crackdown, the United States led an effort in December of 2022 to actually remove Iran, something we were active on and campaigning for, had never happened before, and Iran was actually expelled. Sadly, recently, Saudi Arabia, a country which is making advances, we acknowledge that, but it still has one of the world's worst records on women's rights. Male guardians are still needed for women to do many things. Saudi Arabia was recently elected chair of the Women's Rights Commission. So sadly, UN doesn't seem to be taking its own principles very seriously.
Hillel, you mentioned the United States. JBS viewers may or may not remember that there was a period of time where the United States had withdrawn entirely from the Human Rights Council. From your perspective, Hillel, was it the right decision of the United States to return, or should it have continued to stay out?
You know, I think it's a dilemma. In my 20 years in this position, I saw the United States pull out twice. Once was in 2006, shortly after the Human Rights Council was reformed and created. And then that was under the presidency of George W. Bush. When Obama was elected, he brought America back. And then it happened again at, I'd say, midpoint during the Trump administration. Nikki Haley and John Bolton announced that the U.S. would be pulling out of the Human Rights Council. Now, in my experience, I think you gain something when you pull out, you lose something. You gain something because America makes a statement saying this body is not legitimate. So that's an important point to be made. But you do lose something because the body continues, and most countries do take it seriously. Its resolutions, when it creates commissions of inquiry, its reports do get quoted around the world. So my ideal, and it's hard to get that, we often get, I would say, extremes on each side. My ideal would be to have someone present at the UN, like a Patrick Moynihan in 1975, who gave that incredible speech calling out the Zionism is racism resolution, and like Nikki Haley, who was so articulate when she took the floor, whether it was at the Security Council or the General Assembly, in calling out the abuses of the UN. So I wish that America would have someone with that kind of backbone and would be present and calling out the abuses. That would really, in my opinion, have the best effect. Sadly, we usually get one or another extreme. We usually get either the Republicans are absent, or we get Democrats who may often vote the right way, but often end up being cheerleaders. The Obama administration and the Biden administration have become cheerleaders for the Human Rights Council. And, you know, one could understand a little bit of diplomatic realpolitik requiring them to say certain niceties from time to time, but sadly, they've erred on the side of being cheerleaders of the Human Rights Council.
Hillel, you've been a brave and sometimes a lonely voice in Geneva on behalf of UN Watch and calling out all of the inequities and the injustices. And let's focus in our remaining time on Israel's place. The UN Charter speaks of the equal rights of all member states, large and small. How is Israel treated differently in the United Nations system? We don't have the hours that it would take, so you're going to give us the headlines, please. What do you put at the top of your list?
Well, indeed, as you said, to talk about how Israel is singled out, scapegoated, demonized at the United Nations, which is ground zero for the international campaign to delegitimize Israel, which, as you know, David, because you've been on the front lines for so many years, where Israel was singled out and demonized, now going back well over 5 decades, led by the Arab states, very much together with the Soviet Union. Now, so it's been going on for years, and it is pervasive and it is extreme. Just to, as you asked, just to pick out a few headlines, I would say there is the General Assembly, which is the Parliament of the UN. Today, in 2024, we expect in a given year, we've seen in the past few years, there'll be one resolution on Iran, one on Syria, one on North Korea, and 15 on Israel.
15. I want to make sure everyone
15.
hears that. 15. So more than all the other countries combined.
That is correct. That is correct. And most countries of the world never get criticized at all at the General Assembly. There are 0 resolutions on China, 0 resolutions on Cuba, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. I'd say about more than 185 countries never get mentioned in a single resolution. Israel gets 15. So that's very extreme. And that's in New York at the General Assembly. If we cross the ocean and head to Geneva, the Human Rights Council, which we were mentioning, has in every one of its meetings one agenda item for the whole world. Currently, that's item 4, human rights situations around the world. Should a country wish to give a speech or address what's happening in North Korea or in Ukraine or in Sudan, all happens under the generic general agenda item of item 4. And then another day, they come to item 7, which is human rights violations in the occupied Arab territories, including Palestine, namely Israel. So one agenda item on the whole world and one agenda item one day on Israel alone. No other country, not North Korea, one of the most horrific places on the planet, not Ukraine, where Vladimir Putin is bombarding and murdering thousands of innocent people, not Syria, where both Assad and the Russians and the Iranians have helped kill an estimated 500,000 people. No place in the world is targeted with its own day and its own agenda item. Only the Jewish state, only Israel. And I'll mention just one other example is UNRWA. Next to us in Geneva is the UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees. That is the agency that over decades has helped resettle millions of refugees, whether they're from Syria or Sudan. It's not perfect by any means, but they have resettled millions of refugees. And when there is a crisis, such as we're seeing now in Sudan, where there's some 20 million people who need humanitarian help, about 8 million people displaced, UNHCR is the agency that America and other governments will turn to. So that's for the whole world, except for one situation, the Palestinians. Palestinians have their own agency called UNRWA. It was initially founded for altruistic reasons by the United States, but very quickly America realized that the Palestinians refused to be resettled in the places where they found themselves. These refugees who were in either Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Gaza, or the West Bank, they insisted that the war against Israel is not over, and they refused to acknowledge that they would be moving on. And so UNRWA does not seek to end their refugee status. On the contrary, it perpetuates it. So Palestinians, instead of having, whether it was 6 or 700,000 initially refugees, we now have, according to the UN, nearly 6 million Palestinian refugees, and they are taught that they have the right of return. And we know today that's not a abstract, hypothetical, very nice exercising your right. On October 7th, I think the world saw how Palestinians envision their return. It is brutal, it is bloody, and that is how they are raised. And UNRWA has played a major role in educating generations of Palestinians not to build their future, not to act like the positive-looking Arab states like UAE or Bahrain, which build up to the sky and look to the future, but the way of Hamas, which is that Gaza is not our home. Our home is in Israel. And so when they're given cement, they build down and they build hundreds and hundreds of miles of terror tunnels with the cement that we all gave them to build homes, hospitals, and schools. All of this is being perpetuated by this agency, UNRWA, which we now know is complicit in so many ways with the Hamas terrorist group.
So I need to pause for just a moment, Hillel, to make sure that JBS viewers have absorbed everything you said, because the 3 top headlines are worth remembering and acting on. Headline number 1, that the UN General Assembly in any given year, you've said, will adopt more Israel-specific resolutions than all the other nations in the world combined. Number two,
That's correct.
that the UN Human Rights Council, charged with monitoring and protecting human rights around the world, has a special dedicated agenda item solely and exclusively regarding the so-called occupied territories, meaning it judges Israel guilty before allowing itself to be proven innocent. And every other nation on earth is reviewed, if at all, under a separate agenda item. And number three, every refugee in the world comes under the mandate of the UNHCR, headquartered in Geneva, except for one refugee population, which has its own organization, UNRWA, which has no mandate to resettle and has the authority to define a refugee, a Palestinian refugee, ad infinitum. Am I correct in those three headlines?
Sadly, you are.
So, JBS viewers, if that's not enough to get one both angry and mobilized, I don't know what is, but I'm going to try and make you even more angry. Because you mentioned, Hillel, a woman named Francesca Albanese. I think it's important that JBS viewers understand who she is, what her mandate is as a so-called expert, and why she is so horribly misplaced in that role.
Sure. Look, the UN Human Rights Council, in addition to adopting resolutions, one of their tools is to create mandates to investigate either a region or a particular topic. And in terms of regions, they have about a dozen, maybe now 15 countries that they have a special investigator called a special rapporteur. And the Palestinian territories is one of those 15. Fine, you and I may disagree whether the Palestinian territories ranks as among the top dozen or 15 places that need the world's attention. But all right, if we're going to have a special rapporteur in human rights in the Palestinian territories, maybe that would be fine. We would speak out for victims, whoever is victimized and whoever the perpetrator is. But in fact, what the Human Rights Council has done, and this dates back, going back to February 1993, the old Human Rights Commission is dating back 31 years, the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Palestine is, despite the title, she will call herself the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Palestine. Despite her title, the actual mandate, unchanged since February 1993, is to investigate, and I quote, Israel's violations of the bases and principles of international law in the Palestinian occupied territories. So the mandate from the beginning is to look only at Israel. This means that in the past 3 decades, whenever Hamas, the Jihad, Fatah have attacked Israelis in terrorist attacks, suicide bombing, rockets, and Israel responds to try to stop the terrorists, the UN rapporteur on Palestine will condemn Israel only and say nothing about the Palestinian murder or terrorism that prompted Israel's defensive actions and say, not in my mandate. And technically, he or she is correct. Of course, when the UN wants to, they can address things that are related and part of the context, and they choose not to. And they pick certain individuals. So the latest particular individual that they chose is, as you mentioned, Francesca Albanese. She's an Italian lawyer, now lives, I believe, in Tunisia, has been very active in the Arab world. She used to work as a lawyer for UNRWA that we just mentioned. And it's no accident that UNRWA doesn't really investigate their own staff when they're either members of Hamas terrorist groups, when they regularly incite in favor of terrorism, glorifying Adolf Hitler, things that we've been documenting now for the past 9 years in screenshots of UNRWA teachers and school principals. People, when they have Francesca Albanese as their lawyer for UNRWA, we shouldn't be surprised that they don't get disciplined unless enormous attention is brought and pressure by the United States, for example. So Francesca Albanese was appointed 2 years ago. We told the Human Rights Council, this is someone who regularly equated the Nakba, the alleged Palestinian suffering of 1948, the catastrophe, a word that, as you know, was initially meant the catastrophe of the Arab states' failure to defeat Israel, but over time morphed into the idea of the catastrophe of their plight, of how Israel allegedly victimized them. And she equates the plight of the Palestinians with the Holocaust regularly. So we warned the UN. This is someone who's effectively equating Israelis with Nazis, someone who had regularly accused Israel of apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing, whose husband had done work for the PLO, and the list goes on. If the UN were to be living up to its own standards of impartiality and objectivity in appointing and selecting mandate holders, she would have been the last person that they would have appointed. But sadly, David, that's exactly why they wanted her. It was the Palestinian representative, aided by the Arab and Islamic states and the dictatorships that joined them, the Chinese, the Russians, and they appointed her.
And just to be clear, we don't have a whole lot of time left. The Italian government, which has been quite friendly to Israel, has no role to play in this issue, or does it?
They don't. They don't. It can sometimes the country concerned, it's not even the country concerned, but sometimes they might make their opinions known, but typically they have no role. She was appointed 2 years ago, and typically in the process, they would not be asking Italy.
So I want to be clear, this is not an indictment of the current Italian government.
That's right. They were not involved.
Let me ask you as well, Hillel, because you mentioned Hamas, of course, more than once, and rightly so. To the very best of your knowledge, has any United Nations body ever condemned Hamas by name by a vote of member states?
It's a good question. I don't know if it's by name. Some of the resolutions will say things like all sides should stop. So I'd say there's a handful of resolutions where sometimes in order to get European approval, they might have something about all sides. I'm not aware that there's a resolution that mentions Hamas.
I don't think so. But on the other hand, there's no hesitation to mention Israel in every sentence or two or three. We have just a moment left. So Hillel Neuer has 60 seconds to meet with President Joe Biden, the leader of the United States, and in 60 seconds to tell the president what you, Hillel, think the United States should or should not be doing in this space we've just discussed. What's your advice to the President of the United States?
Well, I would tell the president that America needs to lead the free world. It should be, its positions should be clear. We need moral clarity. And the world is looking to America to lead. They should not be pandering to various regional blocs, should not be in the business of going along to get along. Stand up for American values, stand up for universal human rights, stand up for America's only true democratic ally in the Middle East, Israel, and oppose demonization, which ultimately undermines the very principles of the United Nations itself.
Continue funding UNRWA?
Maybe in the very short term, just to ensure that there's no starvation, but in the end, terrorism at UNRWA is not a bug, it's a feature. UNRWA has to go.
Continue with the Human Rights Council despite that agenda item number 7, which raises serious questions about its credibility?
Only if America will be bold and clear in denouncing the pernicious things that happen there.
And you're suggesting that there's more that America can and should be saying and doing, I gather.
Absolutely. I endorse many of the good things that the current American ambassador has been saying, but there's much more America could do.
Hillel, thank you so much. JBS viewers, I've known Hillel Neuer for a number of years. I know the Geneva scene a bit. As I said, he's often a lonely voice, but I need to tell you, if you don't already know, he's been a tiger. He's unafraid, he's unrelenting, he stands up in very difficult places. Others have tried to silence him from time to time. I urge you to follow the work of UN Watch if you're not already doing so. And again, as we're in the middle of Pesach, I want to wish everyone a happy, meaningful, sweet, and kosher Pesach. This is David Harris, defending Israel.